July 19th, 1944. Normandy, France, 12 kilometers south of Carentan. The morphine had worn off 3 hours ago, and Oberstabsarzt Heinrich Müller could feel every splinter of shrapnel embedded in his left thigh. The July heat pressed down on the makeshift German aid station, a half-collapsed barn that reeked of manure, blood, and something worse. The sweet, nauseating stench of gangrene from the soldiers lying in rows on moldy hay. Flies gathered in biblical swarms. Outside, American artillery rumbled like distant thunder that never quite moved on. Muller pressed his fingers against his temples, trying to think through the pain. 31 years old. Graduate of the Friedrich Wilhelm University in Berlin, class of 1937. 8 years of medical training, 7 years of believing, truly believing, that German science stood at civilization's apex. And now, he sat in his own filth, watching 23-year-old Gefreiter Klaus Brehm die slowly from an infected leg wound that, in any rational universe, should have been survivable. The boy, and that's what he was really, just a boy from Bavaria who'd been drafted on his 20th birthday, had taken a fragment of an American mortar round through the calf muscle 6 days ago. Clean entry, clean exit. Müller had performed the debridement himself, removed the obvious debris, packed the wound with sulfonamide powder from their rapidly depleting stores. Standard protocol. By the book. The kind of treatment that German military medicine had perfected through 5 years of mechanized warfare. And yet, Brehm's temperature had climbed to 40 degrees Celsius by the second day. The skin around the wound had turned the color of spoiled meat, purple and black at the edges, with angry red streaks climbing toward his groin. By the fourth day, the smell had arrived. That distinctive, suffocating sweetness that every military surgeon knew too well. Gas gangrene, Clostridium perfringens, one of the most ancient killers of wounded soldiers, thriving in the oxygen-starved depths of traumatized muscle tissue. Müller had given Brehm more sulfonamides, then more. He'd reopened the wound, cut away the necrotic tissue, packed it again. Nothing worked. The infection spread with the methodical certainty of a mathematical proof. And now, watching the boy's chest rise and fall in rapid, shallow breaths, Müller knew exactly how this would end. How? He'd seen it end this way 417 times since Poland. He kept count. Someone had to. Herr Oberstabsarzt. The voice came from behind him. Hauptmann Werner Schmidt, their unit's last remaining administrative officer, stood in the doorway holding a piece of paper. His uniform, once immaculate, was crusted with dried mud and darker stains. The Americans. They're 2 kilometers out. We've received orders to, that is, whoever can walk should attempt to fall back too. I'm not leaving these men. Schmidt's jaw tightened. Sir, with respect, most of them won't survive the night regardless. And if you stay, then I stay. Müller didn't look up from Brehm's face. The boy's eyes had rolled back, showing mostly whites. His skin had taken on a grayish pallor that Müller recognized from hundreds of previous cases. 6 hours, maybe 8. Then the fever would climb higher, the toxins would overwhelm his organs, and his heart would simply stop. Another name for the lists. Another mother in Bavaria who would receive a letter explaining that her son had died heroically for the fatherland. What the letter wouldn't say, that he died from a wound any competent surgeon should have been able to treat. That he died because they'd run out of effective drugs 3 weeks ago. That he died because the vaunted German pharmaceutical industry, the same industry that had pioneered sulfonamide synthesis, that had produced more aspirin than any nation on earth, couldn't manufacture enough antibacterial agents to keep pace with the Western Front's insatiable appetite for young men's bodies. Schmidt left. Mueller heard him shouting orders outside, heard the wounded who could walk beginning to shuffle away. Then the artillery grew louder. In the end, it wasn't a dramatic battle. No heroic last stand. The American tanks simply appeared at the edge of the field around 1700 hours, massive Sherman monsters that made the earth shake with their approach. Mueller stood in the barn doorway, waving a white bed sheet tied to a broom handle. His hand shook, though whether from fear or exhaustion or the infection beginning in his own wound, he couldn't say. An American captain appeared, flanked by 2 soldiers with their rifles raised. The captain was young, maybe 25, with a Tennessee accent and tired eyes. He looked at Mueller's white coat, at the Iron Cross second class pinned to his collar, at the makeshift hospital behind him. Doctor? Ja? Yes? Mueller's English was rusty, learned from textbooks a decade ago. I am... Physician. 22 wounded. Most cannot move. I request... He paused, searching for the word. Clemency, mercy. The captain lowered his rifle. Jesus Christ. He'd seen the wounded inside. Smelled them. Thompson, get the medics up here. All of them. And radio back for an ambulance company. Tell them we need at least 3 vehicles, maybe more. Within 20 minutes, the barn was swarming with American medical personnel. Mueller watched in a daze as they moved with a calm efficiency that seemed almost choreographed. They had flashlights, real flashlights with strong batteries, not the weak, flickering candles that had been the Germans' only source of light. They had morphine. So much morphine that they gave it freely, without the agonizing rationing calculations Mueller had been forced to make. They had plasma expanders in glass bottles hanging from improvised stands, and they had something else. What's his status? An American major, older, maybe 45, with a medical caduceus on his collar, knelt beside Brame's stretcher. He wore spectacles and had the precise, measured movements of an experienced surgeon. Mueller tried to organize his thoughts. The morphine they'd given him for his own wound was making everything slightly unreal, as if he were watching events through gauze. Mortar fragment. 6 days. Infection. Gangrene. I performed. He gestured helplessly at the wound. Everything. Sulfonamides, debridement, twice. The American major examined the wound with a small penlight. His face remained neutral, professional. Then he turned to a younger lieutenant standing beside him. Prep him for transport. Start him on 10,000 units of penicillin intramuscularly immediately, then set up a drip for continuous administration during transport. We'll need to get him into surgery within 3 hours. Mueller's brain caught on that unfamiliar word. Penicillin? The major looked at him, really looked at him for the first time. Something flickered in his eyes. Not triumph, not cruelty. Something closer to pity. Yeah, penicillin. You guys don't have it? No. I have heard of this in medical journals. Before the war. British research. But for production, He struggled with the English. For many patients, it is not possible. The major finished. Well, we made it possible. He stood up, gesturing to the medics. This kid's going to live, doctor. Probably keep the leg too, if we're lucky. The rest of your boys, we'll do what we can. Some of them are pretty far gone, but... He trailed off, looking around the barn at the German wounded. 22 men, most of whom Mueller had already mentally consigned to death. The major's expression suggested he was performing different calculations, running different equations. Equations that led to different conclusions. Round up whoever's walking wounded or medical personnel, the major said to his lieutenant. They're POWs now, but they can ride in the ambulances. No point making them march. Then to Mueller. That includes you, doctor. Had leg wounds infected. I can smell it from here. But I must... My patients. Your patients are our patients now. The major's voice wasn't unkind, but it was final. War's over for you. For all of you. They loaded Mueller into the 3rd ambulance along with 4 other German wounded and a young American corpsman who looked all of 19 years old. The vehicle's interior was clean, impossibly clean by the standards Mueller had grown accustomed to. White enamel surfaces. Shelves stocked with supplies in neat rows, everything labeled, organized, accessible. The corpsman worked efficiently, checking vitals, adjusting plasma drips, administering morphine when needed. He barely looked at Mueller, not out of cruelty, but because there were 5 patients to monitor, and his professional focus was absolute. The kind of focus Mueller recognized from his own training, back when he'd believed medicine was a pure calling untainted by politics or ideology. Through the ambulance's small rear window, Mueller could see the French countryside rolling past, villages reduced to rubble, fields cratered by artillery, trees stripped of leaves and bark, standing like skeletal sentinels. The war's signature, written across the landscape in violence and destruction. His thigh throbbed with each heartbeat, sending waves of hot pain up into his hip. He could feel the fever building in his blood, that familiar warmth that signaled his body's losing battle against infection. In his professional estimation, and he'd made this diagnosis hundreds of times for other men, he had perhaps 3 or 4 days before the sepsis became overwhelming, maybe a week if he was lucky. The American morphine helped with the pain, but did nothing for the clarity of his thoughts. He kept thinking about young Brame, about that American major's casual certainty. This kid's going to live. As if saving someone from gas gangrene were merely routine. As if infection were no longer an inevitable companion to traumatic injury. Penicillin. He knew the name from pre-war medical journals. A substance isolated from mold by Alexander Fleming in 1928 at St. Mary's Hospital in London. Multiple papers in the British medical literature discussing its remarkable antibacterial properties. But production had always been the problem. The substance was difficult to isolate, difficult to purify, impossible to manufacture in clinically meaningful quantities. Or so Mueller had been told. Or so German medical officers had believed right up until they'd started encountering American wounded who recovered from infections that should have killed them. Right up until rumors began circulating among captured German doctors about this miracle drug that the Americans seemed to have in endless supply. The ambulance hit a pothole, jostling everyone inside. Someone groaned. The corpsman moved immediately to check the source, adjusting a morphine drip, murmuring something soothing in English. Part 2. The American field hospital had been set up in what remained of a chateau outside Isigny-sur-Mer. Someone, probably the French owners, fleeing ahead of the German advance 4 years earlier, had left behind heavy curtains, ornate furniture, marble floors that now served as the foundation for a makeshift surgical ward. But what struck Mueller most forcefully wasn't the elegance of the surroundings. It was the lights. Generators hummed somewhere outside, feeding what seemed like hundreds of electric bulbs strung throughout the building. After weeks of operating by candlelight and weak flashlights, the brightness was almost painful. It made everything hyper-real, each detail sharp-edged and impossible to ignore. Including his own reflection in a cracked mirror someone had propped against one wall, a gaunt face he barely recognized, covered in a week's worth of beard, eyes sunken from dehydration and exhaustion. They'd triaged him upon arrival. Not harshly. No one had been rough with him. No one had seemed particularly interested in revenge or retribution. A nurse with captain's bars had simply examined his wound, taken his temperature, and made a notation on a clipboard. Then she'd pointed him toward a row of cots along one wall. "Wait there. Dr. Brennan will see you within the hour." Within the hour. Not within 3 days, after everyone else had been treated. Not after the critical cases had been stabilized. Within the hour. As if he were just another wounded soldier rather than an enemy physician who, until 6 hours ago, had worn the uniform of the Wehrmacht. The hour passed. Mueller watched the organized chaos of the American medical operation with the analytical part of his mind that still functioned despite the fever. Orderlies moved constantly, ferrying supplies. Nurses checked vital signs, administered medications, changed dressings. Everything happened with a rhythmic efficiency that reminded him of a well-conducted orchestra, each person knowing their part, no wasted motion, no confusion about roles or responsibilities. And the supplies. Dear God, the supplies. Shelves lined with bottles and packages. Boxes stacked in corners, each marked with clear English labels. Sterilization equipment humming away in dedicated rooms. More bandages than Mueller had seen in 3 months at the German aid station. More morphine than he'd been allocated for 50 patients. The waste alone would have sustained his unit for weeks. He watched a nurse discard a pair of surgical gloves that had been used once, just once, and replace them with a fresh pair. Such a small thing. Such an insignificant detail. Yet it spoke volumes about the fundamental differences in how these two armies approached the problem of keeping soldiers alive. Dr. Mueller? An American surgeon approached, chart in hand. He was younger than Mueller, maybe 28, with red hair and freckles that made him look even younger. His uniform bore the insignia of a captain in the medical corps. "I'm Captain Brennan. Let's take a look at that leg." The examination was thorough, but surprisingly gentle. Brennan probed the wound with practiced fingers, palpated the lymph nodes in Mueller's groin, checked the reflexes in his foot. His face remained professionally neutral, though Mueller saw something tighten around his eyes when he leaned in to smell the wound. "How long since the injury?" 31 hours. Mueller's English was improving with necessity. "Shrapnel from, I do not know the word. The gun that shoots up? Anti-aircraft fire?" "Yeah. Yes. I was treating wounded when your planes came. One of your shells, it exploded near. Very near." Brennan nodded, still examining the wound. "You're running a fever. 102 by my guess. Wounds showing early signs of cellulitis. That's the red streaking here. Probably some localized necrosis in the deeper tissue. We caught it early, though. You're lucky." Lucky. The word tasted strange in Mueller's mouth. 22 hours ago, he'd been preparing to die. Now an American surgeon was telling him he was lucky. "Yeah, another day or two and you'd have been looking at possible amputation. But we can treat this." Brennan stood, making notes on his chart. "I'm going to start you on penicillin immediately. Intramuscular injection every 3 hours for the first 24 hours, then we'll reassess. You'll also get sulfadiazine as a backup, and we'll monitor your kidney function. The penicillin sometimes causes issues there, though it's rare." There it was again, that word. Mueller felt his heart rate increase, felt the medical researcher in him surge forward despite the fever and exhaustion. This penicillin. I must ask, how do you have this? In Germany, we hear of it. We read the English papers before the war, but for production in such quantities. Brennan looked at him for a long moment. Then he pulled up a nearby stool and sat down, the chart resting on his knees. When he spoke, his voice carried no triumph, no mockery, just a kind of tired matter-of-factness. 2 years ago, we couldn't have treated you this way. Hell, 6 months ago we didn't have enough to treat our own guys properly. But then the factories got going. Really going. He gestured vaguely toward the supplies stacked around them. We've got production facilities in Peoria, Illinois, that's in the Midwest, producing thousands of liters a week now. They figured out how to grow the mold in huge fermentation vats, figured out how to extract and purify it at scale. Turned it from a laboratory curiosity into ammunition. Ammunition, Mueller repeated. That's how we think of it. Medical ammunition, just as important as bullets or shells. Maybe more important, because what's the point of armor and artillery if your soldiers die from infected scratches? Brennan shook his head. Before penicillin, we were losing maybe 30% of seriously wounded men to infection. Now? Less than 5%. It's revolutionary. 5%. Miller's mind automatically calculated the inverse. 95% survival rate for serious wounds. In his experience with the Wehrmacht, that number had been closer to 60%. On good days, with adequate supplies, which they hadn't had in months. The boy, he said suddenly, young Gefreiter Brame, from the barn, gas gangrene, 6 days progressed. He will truly live? If we got to him in time, and I think we did, then yeah, he'll probably make it. Penicillin's particularly effective against Clostridia. We've seen guys with full-blown gas gangrene make complete recoveries, keep the limb and everything. Brennan stood, preparing to move on to the next patient. You'll see him, probably. PW doctors get housed in the same ward as their patients, once they're ambulatory. We're not monsters. He walked away before Mueller could respond, leaving the German physician alone with his thoughts and his fever and the impossible mathematics of 95% survival. The first injection came 20 minutes later. A young corpsman, African American, which startled Mueller in its own way, since German propaganda had always insisted the Americans would never trust Negroes with medical duties, approached with a metal tray bearing a syringe and a small glass vial. This might sting a bit, sir. The corpsman's voice was polite, professional. No hint of hostility. He swabbed Miller's upper arm with alcohol, drew clear liquid from the vial into the syringe with practiced efficiency, and administered the injection smoothly. It did sting, a sharp, burning sensation that spread from the injection site through the surrounding muscle. But that pain was nothing compared to the throbbing agony in his thigh, so Mueller barely noticed. Someone will be by every 3 hours to give you another dose, the corpsman said, disposing of the needle in a marked container. You need anything, water, food, bedpan, you just let one of the nurses know. Then he was gone, moving on to the next patient. Mueller lay back on his cot, feeling the fever's heat in his face, feeling the infection's poison in his blood, feeling something else too, though he couldn't quite name it. Disorientation, perhaps. Or the cognitive dissonance of receiving advanced medical care from enemies who, according to every briefing he'd attended for the past 5 years, were supposed to be culturally and scientifically inferior to the German people. The Reich's propaganda had been clear on this point. American medicine was crude. American science was derivative. American industry was bloated and inefficient. And yet here he lay, in an American field hospital barely 3 kilometers from active combat, receiving a drug that German pharmaceutical companies had failed to produce, administered by personnel who seemed to have unlimited supplies of everything his own medical corps had been desperately rationing for months. Sleep claimed him eventually, dragging him down into fevered dreams where he wandered through hospitals made of light, where every patient survived, where gangrene was just a word in textbooks, rather than a death sentence scrawled across young men's bodies. He woke to darkness. Not complete darkness, but the dimmed lights of a hospital at night. His mouth tasted of copper, and his thighs still hurt, but differently now. Less like a hot brand pressed against bone, more like a deep bruise. Tolerable. Manageable. "Ah, you're awake." The voice came from his left. Mueller turned his head. The motion made him dizzy, and saw a figure in the next cot. German uniform, officer's insignia. "Welcome to the land of the living, Herr Oberstabsarzt." "Who?" Muller's throat was dry. The words came out as a croak. "Hauptmann Dieter Kleist, Wehrmacht Medical Corps, attached to the 352nd Infantry Division, or what's left of it." The man, Kleist, shifted in his cot, and Mueller saw that his left arm ended in thick bandages at the elbow. Lost the forearm to an American grenade. 3 days ago. They tell me the surgery went well, that the wound is healing cleanly. No infection. Imagine that. "Penicillin?" Mueller said. "Ah, so you know about it too." Kleist's voice carried a strange mix of bitterness and wonder. "Remarkable substance. They gave it to me before the surgery, after the surgery, every few hours like clockwork." The American surgeon, very polite fellow, apologized for having to amputate. He told me that before penicillin, arm amputations had about a 40% mortality rate from post-operative infection. Now it's less than 2%. 2%. Another impossible number. Mueller tried to process it, tried to square it with his own experience of watching men die, despite perfect surgical technique, despite careful wound management, despite everything medicine had to offer. "How long have you been here?" he managed to ask. 4 days. Long enough to realize that everything we were told about the Americans was... Kleist trailed off, searching for words. Not lies, exactly. But not truth either. Selective truth, the kind that conceals more than it reveals. Someone moaned softly in the darkness. Footsteps approached, a night nurse checking on the sound. Mueller heard her murmuring something soothing in English, heard the clink of water being poured into a cup. Then the footsteps receded, and the ward settled back into its nocturnal rhythm of breathing and distant generators and the occasional rustle of someone shifting position. "There's something else you should know," Kleist said softly, "about how they treat us. The Americans." "What do you mean?" "No beatings, no interrogations beyond basic identification, no separation of officers from enlisted men. They feed us the same rations they feed their own soldiers. Not great food, but adequate. Plenty of it." "And the medical care?" He paused. "The medical care is identical to what they give their own wounded. Same drugs, same priority, same standard of treatment." "I've been watching. The nurses don't even seem to distinguish between American and German patients unless they need to communicate something specific." Mueller thought about the African-American corpsman who'd administered his first penicillin injection, about Captain Brennan's matter-of-fact explanation of production capabilities, about the systematic efficiency with which the American medical operation functioned. "We've been taught," he said slowly, "that Americans lack the cultural sophistication for true excellence, that their democracy makes them weak, that their mixing of races dilutes their effectiveness, that German science is superior to all others," Kleist finished. "Yes. I graduated from Heidelberg, class of 34. Studied under some of the finest medical minds in Europe. Believed absolutely in the supremacy of German medical research. He shifted again, and Muller heard pain in the sharp intake of breath. And now, here I am. Alive because of a drug we couldn't manufacture, in a field hospital better equipped than most German civilian hospitals, being treated by doctors who view medicine as a problem to solve rather than an ideology to uphold. Silence stretched between them. Outside, artillery rumbled. Much farther away now as the front moved east. The Americans were winning. Had been winning for months, probably. And lying here in the darkness, his fever beginning to break, his leg no longer screaming with infection, Muller found he could no longer pretend otherwise. The corpsman returned at 0200 hours for the next injection. Same efficient movement, same polite professionalism, same burning sensation as the penicillin entered Muller's muscle tissue. "How are you feeling, sir?" the corpsman asked. "Better," Muller admitted. And it was true. The fever had dropped noticeably. The pain in his leg had dulled from a shriek to a persistent ache. "Thank you." The corpsman smiled, a quick, tired smile, and moved on to his next patient. Muller watched him go, watched him administer medication to an American soldier with the same careful attention he'd shown a German POW. No difference in technique, no difference in care. "Tomorrow," Kleist said from the next cot, "they'll probably have you up and walking. Light exercise, they call it. Helps with recovery. You'll get to see more of this place. The operating theaters, the supplies, the way they've organized everything." A pause. Fair warning. It doesn't get easier. Seeing how thoroughly we've been outmatched, how completely we've been lied to. Muller didn't respond. He lay in the darkness, feeling the penicillin working in his blood, feeling the infections retreat, feeling the slow collapse of certainties he'd held for his entire adult life. Somewhere in the ward, someone was crying quietly. German words, barely audible. Mutti. Mutti, es tut weh. Mother. Mother, it hurts. An American nurse materialized. Muller could see her silhouette against the dimmed lights, and went to the crying soldier. She didn't understand the German words, but she understood pain, understood fear, understood the universal human need for comfort in suffering. She held his hand. She spoke to him in English, her voice low and soothing, and though he probably didn't understand the words either, the tone was enough. The crying quieted. The ward settled again. Muller closed his eyes and tried to sleep, but sleep wouldn't come. His mind kept circling back to numbers. 5% infection mortality instead of 30%. 2% post-amputation death rate instead of 40%. 95% survival for serious wounds. Each number was a life saved. Each percentage point represented dozens, hundreds, thousands of men who would go home instead of dying in hospital tents or aid stations or, if they were particularly unlucky, in barns that reeked of manure and gangrene. The mathematics of mortality had changed, and the change had been engineered in American factories by American scientists working with American industrial capacity. Not through superior ideology, not through racial purity, not through cultural supremacy, through science, industry, and a straightforward commitment to solving problems rather than proving theories. By the time dawn light began filtering through the chateau's damaged windows, Muller had accepted what he'd been trying to deny since he saw that first American medic treat young Brame with casual confidence. Germany was going to lose this war, had probably already lost it in every way that mattered. And men like him, men who'd believed the propaganda, who'd convinced themselves that German science was innately superior, had been complicit in the delusion. The corpsman appeared again at 0500 for another injection. Miller accepted it without comment, watched the clear fluid disappear into his muscle tissue, felt the now familiar burn of the medication spreading through his arm. "Your fever's down," the corpsman noted, checking the chart. "That's good. Means the infection's responding well. Doctor will probably want to examine you again after morning rounds." "How is the boy?" Miller asked suddenly. "Gefreiter Brame. From the barn yesterday. Gas gangrene." The corpsman consulted a different chart, flipping through pages. "Brame. Klaus Brame, yeah. He's in surgery now, actually. They're doing a deeper debridement, but the surgeon's notes say the infection's already responding to treatment. They expect full recovery." He looked up, meeting Miller's eyes. "Your friend's going to be fine, sir." Not his friend, his patient, his failure, his responsibility. But the American corpsman didn't know that Miller had already written that boy off as dead, had already composed the letter to his mother in his mind, had already added him to the running count of 417. Except now it would stay at 417, because Klaus Brame was going to live. "Thank you," Miller said again, and this time the words carried more weight than mere politeness. Part 3. By the third day, they had Muller walking. Not far, just to the latrine and back, a journey of perhaps 40 meters that left him winded and sweating despite the shortness of the distance. But Captain Brennan insisted that mobility was crucial for recovery, that keeping blood flowing prevented complications, that the human body healed better when it was used rather than coddled. "We learned this the hard way in North Africa," Brennan explained as he watched Muller navigate the chateau's marble hallway, one hand braced against the wall for support. "Guys who stayed in bed too long developed pneumonia, blood clots, muscle atrophy. Now we get everyone moving as soon as possible. Speeds recovery, reduces complications." Miller nodded, saving his breath for walking. His legs still hurt. Would probably hurt for weeks. But it was healing pain now, not dying pain. He could feel the difference in his body's response, in the way his fever had broken cleanly rather than spiking into delirium, in the way the wound site felt hot but not poisoned. The penicillin injections continued every 3 hours with mechanical regularity. A different corpsman each time, but always the same efficiency, always the same polite professionalism, always the same clear fluid drawn from small glass vials and pushed into muscle tissue with needles that remarkably appeared to be used only once before being discarded. The waste. God, the waste. It bothered him viscerally, this casual disposal of supplies that would have been hoarded like gold in a German field hospital. But he was beginning to understand that it wasn't waste. Not really. It was a different calculation, one based on the assumption of plenty rather than scarcity. Why reuse needles when clean ones reduced infection risk and you had factories producing thousands per day? Why ration morphine when adequate pain control improved outcomes and you had chemical plants that could manufacture it by the ton? It was a philosophy of medicine that assumed resources were a problem to be solved through production, rather than a constraint to be managed through rationing. And the results spoke for themselves in the 95% survival rates and the 2% mortality figures. And the boys, like Klaus Brame, who kept living when all of Miller's training and experience said they should die. On the fourth day, they moved him to the ambulatory ward, a converted ballroom on the chateau's second floor where POW patients who could walk were housed together. 23 beds arranged in neat rows, windows that actually had glass in them, electric lights overhead. A small library of German books that someone, probably captured from German units, had assembled on a corner shelf. Klaus Brame was already there. Muller recognized him immediately despite the boy's cleaned-up appearance. The same thin face, the same sandy hair, but now with color in his cheeks and clarity in his eyes. He sat propped up in bed, his left leg immobilized in a cast, but his expression alert and focused. Reading something. A letter from the look of it. Gefreiter Brame, Muller said softly, approaching the bed. The boy looked up, and recognition flickered across his face. Herr Oberstabsarzt. He started to sit up straighter, winced at the movement. I did not know you were here. They told me you'd been wounded too, but... Yes. Captured the same day as you. Muller sat carefully on the edge of a nearby bed, favoring his healing leg. How are you feeling? Alive, Breme said simply, which is more than I expected 3 days ago. He looked down at his cast. They say I'll keep the leg. The American surgeon, Captain Murray, he showed me the wound yesterday when they changed the dressing. It's healing. Actually healing. No more... He trailed off, but Muller knew what he'd been about to say. No more stench. No more necrotic tissue. No more creeping certainty of death. The penicillin, Muller said. Yes. They give it to me every 4 hours now. Still hurts when they inject it, but... Brame shrugged. Small price. My mother... He held up the letter he'd been reading. The Americans let me write to her, through the Red Cross. They gave me paper, pen, everything. I told her I'm alive. I told her I'm recovering. His eyes grew bright. I never thought I'd be able to write those words. Neither had Muller. 5 days ago, he'd been mentally composing a very different letter to Frau Brame in Bavaria. A letter explaining that her son had served honorably, had suffered bravely, had died for the fatherland. All the standard phrases that were supposed to make military death meaningful, but mostly just made it slightly more bearable for those left behind. I'm glad, Muller said, and meant it with an intensity that surprised him. Truly glad. They talked for a while. Careful conversation, neither of them quite willing to address the larger implications of their situation. Brame mentioned that some of the other German POWs in the ward were bitter, angry at being captured, insistent that Germany would still win the war. Others were just grateful to be alive and away from combat. A few had already begun learning English from the American medical staff, practical men preparing for whatever future awaited them. Eventually, an American nurse came by to check Brame's vitals and administer medication. She was perhaps 30 years old, with auburn hair pinned up under her cap and competent hands that moved with practiced efficiency. When she spoke to Brame, she used simple German phrases, Guten Tag, wie geht es Ihnen, pronounced carefully, as if from a phrase book. Brame responded in broken English, trying to meet her halfway. The resulting conversation was halting and occasionally confused, but somehow they managed to communicate. She checked his pulse, examined his wound site, made notes on her chart. Before leaving, she smiled at him. A genuine smile, warm and encouraging, and said something in English that Muller didn't quite catch, but that made Brame smile back. She's kind, Brame said after the nurse had moved on to the next patient. They're all kind, really. Not what we were told to expect. No, not what they'd been told. German propaganda had painted the Americans as brutal, undisciplined, prone to atrocities against prisoners. Yet here was an entire medical system that treated captured enemy soldiers with the same care and professionalism it afforded its own troops. More than care, with genuine human compassion, that smile from the nurse that said, "You're going to be okay, in a language that transcended national boundaries. Over the following days, Mueller's mobility improved steadily. By the 6th day, he could navigate stairs without assistance. By the 8th day, they had him helping in the ward. Simple tasks at first, translating for German patients who spoke no English, assisting with bandage changes, providing the kind of basic medical supervision that freed up American personnel for more complex duties. No one seemed concerned that he might try to sabotage treatment or harm patients. No guards followed him around. He was simply given tasks, expected to perform them competently, and trusted to do so. It was a level of trust that would have been unthinkable in reverse. A captured American doctor would never have been allowed such freedom in a German POW facility. The trust extended to information as well. When Mueller asked questions about medical procedures, American doctors answered freely. When he wanted to examine penicillin vials to understand the drug's formulation, someone brought him a sample and let him study it under a microscope in the pathology lab. When he inquired about production processes, Captain Brennan spent an hour explaining the massive fermentation program that had transformed penicillin from laboratory curiosity to mass-produced medicine. It started with a British team, Brennan explained, spreading several medical journals across a table in the chateau's library. Fleming discovered it, but Florey and Chain at Oxford figured out how to extract and purify it. But Britain couldn't scale up production. They were getting bombed, resources were tight, industry was focused on weapons. So they brought the research to us in 41. Mueller examined one of the journals, a copy of the Journal of the American Medical Association from 1943. The cover article, Penicillin, a Wartime Miracle. Inside, detailed charts showing production volumes, clinical outcomes, bacterial sensitivity profiles. Everything presented openly, published for the world to see. We tried growing it in bottles at first, Brennan continued, but that was too slow, too inefficient. Then some researchers at the USDA lab in Peoria, that's where we do a lot of agricultural research, they figured out they could use corn-steep liquor as a growth medium. Cheap, abundant, and the penicillium mold loved it. Production went from liters per month to thousands of liters per week. And the pharmaceutical companies? Mueller asked, still paging through the journal. They cooperated. The government basically ordered them to. Pooled patents, shared research, coordinated production. Pfizer, Squibb, Merck, Abbott, all the major manufacturers. Built dedicated facilities, retooled plants, trained personnel. Brennan smiled slightly. It helped that there was obvious profit potential after the war. But during the war, it was all about volume. Making enough to treat every wounded soldier, every civilian with bacterial pneumonia, every case where infection was the difference between life and death. Every case. Mueller thought about the calculations he'd been forced to make in that barn south of Carentan. 23 wounded men, supplies for maybe 8 courses of sulfonamide treatment. Who gets medicine? Who dies? How do you weigh one life against another? The Americans had simply removed the equation, made the question irrelevant through sheer industrial capacity. In Germany, he said slowly, we have the IG Farben Consortium, massive chemical industry, invented the sulfonamides. We believed, he paused, choosing words carefully. We were told that German chemistry was without peer, that our research was superior, our industrial processes more efficient. Brennan's expression remained neutral, but something shifted in his eyes. And now? Now I wonder what else we were told that wasn't true. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable, exactly. More contemplative. Finally, Brennan stood, gathering up the journals. You're a good doctor, Muller. I've watched you work with the patients here. You care about saving lives. That matters more than what country you're from or what you were told to believe. He headed toward the door, then paused. War ends eventually. Medicine continues. Remember that. On the 10th day, they brought in a new batch of German wounded from a skirmish near St. Lô. 15 men in various states of injury. Gunshot wounds, shrapnel trauma, one with third-degree burns across 40% of his body. Mueller helped with triage, his German allowing him to quickly assess complaints and symptoms before American doctors began treatment. One of the wounded was Oberleutnant Franz Höcker, a line officer from the Panzerlehr Division. He'd taken 2 rifle rounds through his abdomen, through and through wounds that had somehow missed major blood vessels, but certainly violated his intestines. Without surgery, he'd be dead from peritonitis within 48 hours. With surgery, but without antibiotics, he might last a week before infection claimed him. The American surgeons operated within 2 hours of his arrival. Mueller observed from the gallery. They'd given him permission, even encouraged it, as if his German medical credentials automatically qualified him to learn from their techniques. The surgical theater was spotlessly clean, brilliantly lit, equipped with modern anesthesia machines and monitoring equipment that Mueller had only seen in peacetime university hospitals. 3 surgeons worked on Höcker simultaneously, 1 handling the anesthesia and vital signs, 2 operating. They opened his abdomen, located the perforations in his small intestine, resected the damaged sections, performed anastomoses to reconnect healthy tissue. Clean technique, efficient movements, no wasted time. And before closing, they irrigated the peritoneal cavity with a saline solution containing dissolved penicillin. Prevents peritonitis, one of the surgeons commented, noticing Mueller's attention from the gallery. We dump penicillin directly into the abdomen. Kills any bacteria that might have escaped from the intestinal perforation. Survival rate for abdominal gunshot wounds went from maybe 20% to over 70% once we started doing this. 20% to 70%. Another impossible number. Another life saved through chemistry and industrial capacity and the systematic application of scientific principles. Höcker woke in recovery 2 hours later, groggy, confused, in pain despite the morphine, but alive, infection-free, already receiving intravenous penicillin to maintain bacterial suppression while his intestines healed. Mueller sat with him that evening, translating for the American nurses, explaining what had happened. Höcker listened with the glazed attention of someone still half-drugged, but when Mueller mentioned the penicillin, something focused in his eyes. I've heard about this, Höcker said, in my unit. The men talk. They say the Americans have a miracle drug, that they never die from infections. We thought it was propaganda, exaggeration. It's real, Mueller said quietly. I've seen it work. I'm alive because of it. Höcker was silent for a long moment, staring up at the ceiling. When he spoke again, his voice was bitter. They told us we were superior. Our equipment, our training, our science. Everything better than the enemy. And now, he gestured weakly at his bandaged abdomen. Now I'm alive because the enemy has better medicine than we do. Yes, Mueller said simply. Because what else could he say? What comfort could he offer in the face of that truth? That night, lying in his own bed in the ambulatory ward, Mueller thought about superiority, about the National Socialist doctrine he'd absorbed through years of education and indoctrination, about the certainty with which he'd believed in German preeminence, in racial hierarchies, in the natural order that placed Germanic peoples at civilization's apex. And he thought about the African-American corpsman who'd saved his life by administering penicillin without hesitation or resentment. About the American nurses who treated German patients with the same compassion they showed their own countrymen. About the industrial system that had transformed a British discovery into a tool for saving hundreds of thousands of lives, regardless of nationality. Superiority, he realized, wasn't about ideology or propaganda or racial theories. It was about results. About whether your soldiers lived or died. About whether your industry could produce what your military needed. About whether your science served humanity or merely reinforced comfortable lies. By those measures, the only measures that mattered when you were lying in a hospital bed watching infection, either kill you or spare you. Germany had lost its claim to superiority years ago, had perhaps never possessed it in the first place. The realization didn't come as a dramatic epiphany. No moment of blinding insight, no sudden collapse of belief. Just a slow erosion, like water wearing away stone. Each penicillin injection wore away a little more of his certainty. Each saved life demonstrated another failure of the system he'd served. Each American medical procedure revealed another gap between propaganda and reality. By the time sleep claimed him that night, Heinrich Müller had accepted what he'd been avoiding since his capture. Everything he'd believed about German superiority was wrong. Not partially wrong, not wrong in detail, but right in principle. Fundamentally, completely, catastrophically wrong. And if that was wrong, what else might be? Part 4. The chateau's library became an unlikely gathering place for captured German medical personnel. By mid-August of 1944, the Americans had accumulated perhaps 30 German doctors and medics in the facility, all recovering from wounds or simply awaiting transfer to more permanent POW camps. They congregated in the library during evening hours, speaking in low voices about what they'd seen, what they'd learned, what it meant. Müller attended these informal sessions, listening more than speaking at first. The conversations followed predictable patterns: initial denial, angry defensiveness, gradual acknowledgement, finally a kind of shell-shocked acceptance. Some of the doctors clung to propaganda explanations. The Americans had stolen British research, had unfair access to resources, had sacrificed quality for quantity. Others skipped straight to bitter resignation, accepting that Germany had been outmatched in yet another crucial domain. But a few, a growing few, asked deeper questions. "It's not just the penicillin," said Stabsarzt Ludwig Richter one evening. He was perhaps 40 years old, balding, with the tired eyes of a man who'd seen too many deaths. "It's the entire system, the logistics, the supply chains, the way they've organized everything from factory to field hospital." Hauptmann Kleist, his arm stump now healing cleanly, nodded. "I've been watching their inventory management. They track everything, every vial of medicine, every bandage, every surgical instrument. They have forms for requisitions, forms for distribution, forms for waste disposal. Everything documented, everything accounted for. Like a business," another doctor interjected. "Müller didn't know his name. They run their military medical system like an efficient business operation. And we?" Richter's laugh was harsh. "We run ours like a medieval fiefdom. Each unit hoarding supplies, each commander making his own decisions about priorities, no central coordination, no systematic planning." Müller thought about the barns south of Corentin, about the moldy hay and the insufficient sulfonamides and the impossible choices, about the 23 wounded men he'd been trying to treat with resources adequate for perhaps 8. Yes, a medieval fiefdom. That description fit uncomfortably well. I spoke with Captain Brennan yesterday, Miller offered, about penicillin production. He showed me technical papers, production statistics, everything published openly in medical journals. He paused, remembering his surprise. They're not keeping it secret. They want the world to know. They want other countries to develop production capabilities after the war. Of course they do, said a younger doctor whose name Miller recalled as Martin Schneider, because they're not afraid of competition. They know their industrial capacity can outproduce anyone else. Sharing knowledge doesn't threaten them. It proves their superiority. Not superiority, Mueller said carefully. Capability? There's a difference. Schneider looked at him sharply. Is there? What's the practical distinction? Superiority implies inherent qualities. Better genetics, better culture, better racial characteristics. Capability is about systems, organization, industrial development. Mueller chose his words precisely, aware that they were treading on dangerous ground. One is ideology, the other is engineering. Silence fell over the group. Outside, distant thunder rumbled, actual thunder this time, not artillery. A summer storm moving in from the channel. Rain began pattering against the chateau's windows. My father, Kleist said quietly, is a professor at the University of Munich. Chemistry. He's published more than 80 papers, trained dozens of doctoral students, received awards from the Reich Science Ministry. Before the war, he was certain, absolutely certain, that German science was a decade ahead of the rest of the world. He stared at his arm stump. I wrote to him 3 days ago, through the Red Cross. I told him about the penicillin, about the American medical system. I wonder what he'll think. He'll think you've been brainwashed by enemy propaganda, Richter said flatly. That's what my colleagues in Berlin will think, that I've been corrupted, that I've betrayed German science by acknowledging American achievements. But it's not betrayal, Mueller insisted. It's observation. It's drawing conclusions from evidence. Isn't that what science is supposed to be? Letting reality determine your beliefs rather than letting beliefs determine what you see as real? Another doctor, an older man whose name Mueller had never learned, spoke up for the first time. I trained under Sauerbruch himself at Charité Hospital. Do you know what he used to tell us? That German medicine was the finest in the world because Germans possessed a unique combination of intellectual rigor and cultural discipline. He said this wasn't arrogance, it was simply acknowledging observable fact. The old doctor's voice cracked slightly. I believed him. God help me. I believed every word. We all believed, Schneider said, or at least, we convinced ourselves we believed. It was easier than questioning. Safer than doubting, the conversation continued late into the evening, circling around uncomfortable truths, approaching and retreating from conclusions that would have been unthinkable 3 months earlier. Eventually, men drifted away to their beds, leaving Mueller alone in the library with Kleist and Richter. What happens after the war? Kleist asked, more to himself than his companions. When we go home. If we go home, what do we tell people? That everything we fought for was based on lies? That our enemies were better scientists, better organizers, better at the fundamental tasks of keeping soldiers alive? We tell the truth, Richter said simply. What else can we do? But Mueller wondered if truth would be enough or even possible. How could you explain to someone who hadn't lived it? How could you describe the experience of watching your foundational beliefs dissolve? Watching reality systematically dismantle every certainty you'd been taught? How could you make them understand that German superiority, the central myth of the National Socialist state, was exactly that, a myth sustained by propaganda and isolation from contrary evidence? In late August, the Americans relocated Mueller and several other recovered German medical officers to a larger POW facility near Cherbourg. The camp held perhaps 3,000 German prisoners, mostly combat troops captured during the Normandy fighting. Conditions were Spartan but adequate. Tents arranged in organized rows, latrines that actually functioned, regular meals that weren't lavish but provided sufficient calories, and a medical facility. Of course, there was a medical facility, properly equipped, properly staffed, operating with the same systematic efficiency Mueller had observed at the chateau. German doctors were invited, not ordered, invited, to assist with treating German patients under American supervision. Mueller volunteered immediately. The work was familiar, but strange. Familiar because illness and injury followed predictable patterns regardless of nationality or circumstances. Strange because he had access to proper equipment, adequate supplies, and most importantly, penicillin for any case that required antibiotics. He worked alongside an American major named Samuel Cohen, a surgeon from Philadelphia who spoke passable German learned from his grandparents. Cohen treated Mueller as a professional colleague rather than an enemy prisoner, consulted him on cases, asked his opinion on treatment plans, even deferred to Mueller's judgment on matters of German military medical protocol. "I don't understand your system," Cohen admitted one afternoon as they changed dressing on a German corporal's leg wound. "How you guys decided who got treatment and who didn't. We've captured your medical supplies. There's just not much there. Basic sulfonamides, minimal morphine, barely any surgical equipment. How were you supposed to save lives with that?" "We weren't," Mueller said quietly. "Not really. We were supposed to do our best with what we had and accept that most serious cases would die. It was considered heroic, demonstrating German stoicism in the face of inevitable loss." Cohen paused in his work, looking at Mueller with an expression between pity and incomprehension. "That's insane. Medically insane. You don't build a military medical system around accepting casualties. You build it around preventing them." "Yes," Mueller agreed. "I understand that now." Over the following weeks, Mueller saw the full scope of the American medical operation in France. Ambulance companies that could evacuate wounded from front lines within hours. Field hospitals equipped with portable X-ray machines and modern surgical suites. Supply depots stacked with medications, plasma, bandages, splints, anesthetics. A network of evacuation ships and hospitals stretching back across the English Channel to Britain and from there to the United States. And penicillin. Always penicillin. Administered so routinely that it ceased to be remarkable, became simply standard procedure for any significant injury or infection. Mueller watched hundreds of cases that would have ended in death or amputation in German hospitals instead end in complete recovery. Watched American doctors treat wounds as problems to be solved rather than fates to be accepted. The statistical evidence was overwhelming. In the American medical system, battlefield mortality from infection had dropped to less than 1%. 1%. In the German system, it remained above 30%, and that was before you factored in deaths from supply shortages, inadequate evacuation, and simple triage decisions to let unsavable cases die rather than waste resources. The numbers haunted Mueller. He found himself doing calculations late at night, lying in his tent listening to the sounds of 3,000 German soldiers trying to sleep. If Germany had possessed American medical capabilities, how many lives would have been saved? 10,000? 50,000? More? And if that gap extended to other domains, industrial production, logistics, technological development, what did it mean for the war's outcome? September brought news of Allied advances into Belgium and toward the German border. The Wehrmacht was in full retreat across France, abandoning equipment, losing men by the thousands. In the POW camp, German soldiers who'd been captured in June and July watched newcomers arrive with stories of collapsing defensive lines, of American armored columns that seemed to have unlimited fuel and ammunition, of Luftwaffe fighters that never appeared to contest Allied air superiority. The war was lost. Even the most ardent National Socialists in the camp could see it now, though many still clung to fantasies of miracle weapons or political settlements or some deus ex machina that would reverse the inevitable. Müller had stopped hoping for German victory weeks ago. Now he hoped merely for survival, his own, and that of the men under his medical care, and for an end that would come soon enough to spare Germany further destruction. In late September, they received news through the Red Cross that Soviet forces had entered Romania. In early October, the Americans broke through the Siegfried Line in multiple locations. By mid-October, German prisoners in the Cherbourg camp understood viscerally what their government's propaganda still denied. The Third Reich was dying, and the end would come within months. Among the captured German doctors, conversations grew more candid, more willing to acknowledge uncomfortable truths. They compared notes on what they'd seen, what they'd learned, what waited for them after the war. Some talked about emigrating, to America if possible, to South America if necessary, anywhere that would allow them to practice medicine without the taint of the Nazi regime. Others spoke of returning to Germany to help rebuild, to create a medical system based on evidence rather than ideology. "We failed," Richter said one evening, sitting with Müller and Kleist outside their tent. October had brought cold winds from the Channel, and they huddled in their Wehrmacht greatcoats for warmth. Not just as doctors, as Germans. We allowed ourselves to believe comfortable lies because the truth was too troubling to examine. We were trained to believe, Kleist countered, from childhood, the Hitler Youth, the university lectures, the propaganda everywhere. How were we supposed to resist that? Others did, Müller said quietly. Not many, but some. People who looked at the evidence and drew different conclusions. People who valued truth over comfort. He thought about the African-American corpsmen, about the American nurses, about Captain Brennan's matter-of-fact explanation of penicillin production. They weren't smarter than us. They just lived in a system that rewarded reality-based thinking instead of punishing it. So what does that make us? Kleist asked. Victims? Collaborators? Fools? All three, Richter said. And responsible regardless. We may not have chosen the system we grew up in, but we chose to serve it. We chose to accept its lies because they flattered our egos and confirmed our prejudices. That's on us. The conversation lapsed into silence. Nearby, other prisoners played cards by the light of kerosene lamps, their voices a low murmur in German. Guards patrolled the perimeter, American soldiers who looked impossibly young, who chewed gum and smoked cigarettes, and seemed more bored than hostile. The whole camp had an atmosphere of anticlimactic conclusion, as if everyone, captors and captives alike, were simply waiting for formalities to play out. Müller thought about young Klaus Brehm, who'd been transferred to a British POW facility in August. The boy had hugged him before leaving, tears streaming down his face, thanking Müller for saving his life, even though it had been American penicillin and American surgeons who'd actually done the saving. Thought about Oberleutnant Hooker, who'd survived his abdominal surgery and was now working in the camp library, teaching English to other prisoners. Thought about the 417 men who died under his care before capture, and how many of them might have lived if Germany had possessed just a fraction of America's medical capabilities. After the war, he said suddenly, "I'm going to write about this, about what we saw here, about penicillin and the American medical system and what it revealed about the lies we believed. Maybe no one will read it. Maybe they'll call me a traitor, but someone needs to document the truth. They'll call you worse than a traitor," Richter warned. "The National Socialists who survive, and some will survive, they'll paint you as corrupted by the enemy, brainwashed, weak." "Let them," Mueller said. "I've seen too many men die from infections that should have been treatable. I've seen the alternative. I can't unknow what I know now." Kleist smiled slightly, humorlessly. "Then we're all corrupted. Everyone in this camp who's worked in the medical facility, who's seen what American medicine can do, we've all been infected with reality." "Good," Mueller said. "Maybe that's the only infection worth spreading." Part 5. The winter of 1944 into 1945 brought harsh cold to northern France and a deepening sense of finality to the Cherbourg POW camp. News filtered in through Red Cross channels and captured German newspapers. The Battle of the Bulge had failed. The Rhine crossings were imminent. Soviet armies were advancing on Berlin. The Third Reich was collapsing not gradually but catastrophically, its defeat total and unconditional. Among the German medical personnel, the end of the war meant different things. Some saw liberation, freedom from service to a regime they'd grown to despise. Others saw only uncertainty, wondering what future awaited them in a defeated Germany. A few still nursed impossible hopes for reprieve, for some last-minute reversal that would validate their years of service and sacrifice. Mueller felt mostly numbness. The infection in his leg had healed completely by November, leaving only a scar and occasional stiffness when weather fronts moved through. The physical wound had closed. The psychological one remained open, raw, still painful to probe. He continued working in the camp medical facility through the winter, treating everything from pneumonia to frostbite to the occasional suicide attempt. The American doctors treated him as a trusted colleague now, gave him increasing responsibility, even consulted him on cases involving German prisoners whose medical histories or psychology they didn't fully understand. In January, a Red Cross parcel arrived containing letters from Germany. Mueller's family, his wife Margaret, his 2 daughters, his parents, were alive in Hamburg, though the city had been heavily bombed. They wrote carefully, avoiding politics, focusing on daily life and expressions of hope for his safe return. Reading between the lines, Mueller understood that they lived in fear, that the Nazi state's grip remained tight even in its death throes, that speaking honestly could still bring catastrophe. He wrote back equally carefully, telling them he was well, that he was working as a doctor, that he looked forward to reunion. He didn't mention penicillin, didn't mention the shattering of his beliefs, didn't mention that he'd become complicit in documenting the superiority of the enemy's medical system. Some truths were too dangerous for letters that might be intercepted, but he continued writing in secret, documenting what he'd observed in detailed notes hidden among his personal effects. Descriptions of American medical procedures, statistics on survival rates, technical specifications of penicillin production as explained to him by American doctors, a systematic accounting of the gap between propaganda and reality, between what he'd been told to believe and what he'd witnessed with his own eyes. If he survived to return to Germany, these notes would become a book. If he didn't survive, Perhaps they'd be discovered by someone who could use them. Either way, the truth needed preservation, needed voices willing to speak it regardless of personal cost. May 8th, 1945. Victory in Europe Day. The announcement came through camp loudspeakers in English, then German. Unconditional surrender of all German armed forces, effective immediately. The war in Europe was over. The Third Reich had ceased to exist. In the POW camp, the response was mixed. Some German prisoners wept, from relief, from grief, from complex emotions that had no simple names. Others sat in stunned silence, processing the end of everything they'd known. A few cheered quietly, grateful merely to have survived. The American guards celebrated openly, but without cruelty toward their captives. Someone broke out whiskey. Someone else produced a phonograph and American swing music. Young soldiers who'd been killing Germans 6 months earlier now danced in the camp's central compound, drunk on victory and the intoxicating knowledge that they'd lived through it. Mueller watched from outside the medical facility, trying to feel something definitive. Relief? Certainly. Grief? For the hundreds of thousands dead? Yes. Anger? At the waste, the lies, the unnecessary suffering? Absolutely. But mostly he felt exhausted, wrung out, emotionally depleted. Major Cohen found him there, offered him a flask of bourbon. "You okay, Heinrich?" They'd progressed to first names months ago, an informality that would have been unthinkable in German military culture, but seemed natural in the American system. Mueller accepted the flask, took a cautious sip. The alcohol burned going down, warm in his stomach. "I don't know what I am," he admitted. "My country has been destroyed. Everything I believed has been proven false. Half my medical colleagues are probably dead, and I'm alive because of enemy medicine that my own government couldn't produce." He took another sip. "How am I supposed to feel?" Cohen was quiet for a moment, watching the celebration in the compound. "In 48 hours, I'll be transferred back to England, then home to Philadelphia. I'll go back to Presbyterian Hospital, back to my practice, back to my life. This'll become a story I tell my children, the time I spent in France, the people I treated, the war I survived. And you'll go home eventually. Could be months, could be a year, depends on how quickly they process POWs. You'll find your family, rebuild your practice, figure out how to live in whatever Germany becomes." Cohen returned the flask to his pocket. "The war's over. Now comes the harder part, living with what we learned from it." "I learned that I was wrong," Mueller said quietly. "About everything I thought was important. About science, about medicine, about what makes a nation strong. I learned that propaganda is a more dangerous infection than any bacteria." "Good," Cohen said. "Then you learned the right lessons. Not everyone will. Some of your countrymen will spend the rest of their lives denying, rationalizing, insisting they were betrayed rather than simply beaten. But you've got a chance to be different, to help build something better. If anyone will listen, someone will. Not everyone, but someone." Cohen clasped his shoulder briefly. "Keep documenting what you saw here. Keep telling the truth about American medicine, about penicillin, about the gap between Nazi propaganda and reality. It matters. History matters. Truth matters, even when it's uncomfortable." The major walked away to join the celebration, leaving Mueller alone with his thoughts and the distant sound of American jazz carrying across the darkening camp. The war was over. The dying was done. At least the organized, mechanized, systematic dying of industrial warfare. What came next remained uncertain, unwritten, full of possibilities both hopeful and terrifying. But Mueller knew one thing with absolute certainty. He would never again accept comfortable lies in place of uncomfortable truths. He would never again subordinate evidence to ideology. He would never again allow authority to override his own observations and judgments. Penicillin had saved his life. But more than that, it had shattered his faith in the system that had shaped him, had forced him to confront realities he'd spent years avoiding. In a strange way, that shattering was its own form of salvation, painful but necessary, destructive but ultimately cleansing. The infection of propaganda had been cut away, debrided like necrotic tissue, treated with the antiseptic of direct experience. What remained was raw and tender, but it was clean. It could heal. It would heal, given time and care and a commitment to honesty. Mueller returned to his tent, retrieved his hidden notes, added a new entry dated May 8th, 1945. The war has ended. Our delusions should end with it. We were not superior. We were not destined for greatness. We were not chosen by history or genetics or culture to dominate others. We were simply men, no better or worse than any others, who allowed ourselves to believe lies because they flattered our egos and confirmed our prejudices. That belief cost millions of lives. It cost us our nation. It cost us any claim to moral authority. The least we can do now is acknowledge the truth and try to do better. He hid the notes again, lay back on his cot, and tried to imagine a future in a Germany without Nazis, without Wehrmacht, without the apparatus of propaganda that had defined his adult life. The image remained hazy, uncertain, but not entirely without hope. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight the war was over. The dying had stopped. And in a POW camp in northern France, a German doctor who'd lost his faith in lies began the slow process of learning to live with truth. Epilogue. Heinrich Müller returned to Hamburg in February of 1946, nearly 2 years after his capture. The city his family inhabited bore little resemblance to the Hamburg he'd left in 1939. Whole neighborhoods had been reduced to rubble by Allied bombing. Survivors lived in basements and makeshift shelters, scrounging for food, burning furniture for heat. The proud symbols of Nazi authority, the flags, the monuments, the imposing administrative buildings, had been torn down or repurposed by occupation forces. He found his family thinner, traumatized, but alive. Margaret had kept their children fed through the final months of the war by trading family heirlooms on the black market. She'd navigated the chaos of the Nazi collapse and the British occupation with resourcefulness born of desperation. When she saw him, gaunt, prematurely aged, carrying only a small bag of possessions, she wept for the first time in years. His daughters barely recognized him. They'd been children when he left. Now they were young women who'd grown up amid air raids and starvation and the systematic destruction of everything familiar. They looked at him with caution, as if uncertain whether to trust this stranger wearing their father's face. It took months to rebuild even basic family bonds. Months more to establish a medical practice in a city where half the population suffered from malnutrition and trauma-related disorders. But Müller worked persistently, treated patients without regard for their political history or ability to pay, slowly built a reputation as a competent and compassionate physician. And he wrote, in the evenings, after clinics, he expanded his POW notes into a comprehensive manuscript documenting his experiences with American military medicine. He wrote about penicillin production, about the systematic differences between German and Allied medical systems, about the lies he'd been told and the truths he'd witnessed. He wrote with clinical precision, but also with emotion, trying to convey not just facts, but the psychological impact of discovering that everything you'd believed was wrong. The manuscript's publication in 1949 caused a minor scandal. Nazi sympathizers, and there were still many in Germany, though they'd learned to be quieter about their views, accused Muller of collaboration, of betraying German honor, of exaggerating Allied superiority out of personal cowardice. Medical colleagues split. Some praised his honesty, others shunned him for acknowledging uncomfortable truths. But the book found readers. Young German medical students, hungry for truth after years of propaganda. Allied occupation officials interested in German perspectives on the war's medical dimensions. International researchers studying the development and deployment of penicillin. The work was translated into English, then French, then eventually into a dozen languages. Muller never claimed his book was objective or comprehensive. In the preface, he wrote, "This is one man's account of personal transformation." I do not speak for all German doctors, many of whom served honorably despite the evil system they were part of. I speak only for myself, documenting what I saw and how it changed me. If that documentation helps others understand how propaganda functions, how it distorts perception and enables atrocity, then the discomfort of writing it will have been worthwhile. In the decades that followed, similar accounts emerged from other German POW doctors who'd encountered American penicillin. Their stories varied in details but converged on common themes: shock at the supply abundance, amazement at survival rates, gradual recognition that German science had been outpaced in a crucial domain. Collectively, these testimonies documented a moment when individual German physicians were forced to confront the gap between Nazi propaganda and medical reality. The post-war German medical establishment embraced penicillin eagerly, establishing domestic production facilities and incorporating the drug into standard treatment protocols. By 1950, German pharmaceutical companies were manufacturing penicillin at scale, and German doctors were achieving infection survival rates comparable to their Allied counterparts. The industrial and scientific gap had closed, not because German science had suddenly become superior, but because Germany had abandoned ideological constraints in favor of pragmatic learning from others. Muller continued practicing medicine until his retirement in 1973. He trained medical students, lectured on medical ethics, and served as a consultant to West Germany's public health ministry. When students asked him about his wartime experiences, he was frank. "I served a criminal regime. I believed its lies because they were comfortable, and questioning them was dangerous. I'm not proud of that. But I learned eventually to value truth over comfort. That's the most important lesson any physician can absorb." He died in 1987 at age 74, his obituary noting his contributions to post-war German medicine and his role in documenting the impact of penicillin on World War II medical outcomes. Among his personal effects, his children found the original handwritten notes from the Cherbourg POW camp, hundreds of pages of precise observation, careful analysis, and painful self-examination. They donated the papers to the University of Hamburg's Medical History Archive, where they remain available to researchers studying the intersection of medicine, war, and propaganda. Klaus Brame, the young Bavarian soldier whose gas gangrene Muller had failed to treat but American penicillin had cured, survived the war and lived until 2006. He kept a photograph from 1944 showing himself and several other recovered German POWs outside the American field hospital in Normandy. On the back, in faded ink, he'd written, The day I learned that medicine has no nationality and that healing recognizes no borders. We were enemies. They saved our lives anyway. This is what civilization looks like. The photograph hangs now in the Imperial War Museum in London, part of an exhibit on wartime medicine. Visitors pause before it, reading Brahm's inscription, studying the faces of young men who'd been granted second chances by a drug most of them had never heard of until it saved them. The image captures something essential about that moment in history: the collision between ideology and evidence, between propaganda and reality, between the lies nations tell themselves and the truths that medical science reveals. Penicillin didn't end the war that required millions of soldiers, thousands of tanks, vast expenditures of blood and treasure. But it exposed a truth that propaganda had worked desperately to conceal. German claims of scientific and cultural superiority were hollow, based on nothing more substantial than repetition and enforced belief. When confronted with measurable outcomes, survival rates, infection mortality, industrial production, the claims collapsed into dust. For German doctors like Heinrich Müller, that collapse was simultaneously devastating and liberating. Devastating because it destroyed foundational beliefs, because it revealed complicity in a system built on lies, because it demanded acknowledgement of failure and waste. Liberating because it opened space for growth, for learning, for building something better on the ruins of discredited ideology. The lesson echoes across decades. Truth revealed through evidence is more powerful than any comfortable lie. Science that serves human need is superior to science that serves political authority. Medicine that heals, regardless of nationality, demonstrates civilization's highest potential. And sometimes, the most profound transformations come not from victory, but from defeat, from the shattering of false certainties that allows real wisdom to emerge. In the end, penicillin saved more than individual lives. It saved the possibility of honest medicine, reality-based science, and the recognition that human value transcends national boundaries. For men like Müller, who lived through that revelation, it was worth any amount of discomfort to spread the truth. We were wrong. We were beaten, and we deserved to be, because we'd subordinated reality to ideology. That acknowledgement, painful as it was, became the foundation for everything that came after. The war ended. The dying stopped. The healing began. And in quiet offices and hospital wards across a rebuilt Germany, doctors who'd once believed in racial superiority learned instead to believe in evidence, in outcomes, in the fundamental equality of human life. That transformation, born in POW camps and field hospitals, sustained by the simple act of treating infections that should have been fatal, represented penicillin's truest triumph. Not just saving bodies, but changing minds.